When I look through the Bible for evidence about who Jesus is, I could look for what the writers of the Bible say, the labels they give, what St. Paul says about Jesus, or what the authors of the Gospels say. But I do like to take a slightly different tack. I look at Jesus' actions, and I examine Jesus' actions for what they say to me that Jesus is. Think about the things that Jesus did a lot of. Jesus healed people. He forgave people of their sins. He brought people together and back into community. These actions indicate to me that Jesus is a restorer of community, that Jesus is a builder of communities based on love and grace and forgiveness. When Jesus healed someone of a physical ailment, that did more than just bring them physical peace. It actually brought them back into their family life. It made them able to be contributors to society. And most importantly, it meant that they were able to go back to the temple and worship God. So through the simple act of healing someone of a physical disease, Jesus actually restored family community, religious community, and then through that, relationship with God. When Jesus forgave someone of their sins or welcomed an outcast to the table, Jesus was restoring and building loving community. Even right up to the point of his death on the cross, when Jesus looked down and saw his mother Mary and his disciple John, he says to John, "This is your mother," and to Mary, "This is your son." He's bringing people together in loving community. And as a follower of Jesus, I believe that that is the mission of the church as well, to continue the work of Jesus, which is possible only through grace and love and forgiveness which comes from God. So to answer that question really simply, who Jesus is answered by what Jesus does. And that is to bring divine love and grace and forgiveness and build and restore community and relationship.
The Gospels tell us a lot about who Jesus is, but I think essentially they're a reflection of communities of faithful people trying to make sense of who Jesus was for them, particularly in the light of the resurrection. And so while the scriptures tell us that Jesus was the Son of God, Jesus was a great teacher, a miracle worker, all sorts of things, it was communities of people living in the light of the resurrection trying to understand who this person was that they'd heard stories about. Yeah, so people try to make that sense of that for themselves. So they'd heard stories or they knew people who'd experienced this person firsthand, and as they gathered together as community of faith, they wanted to understand those things for themselves. And so when they wrote down the stories, those things sort of came out in what was written down. And so as they worked out what it meant to live as people faithful to the memory of Jesus Christ, those things sort of arose out of that experience. So it made sense to think of Jesus as the Son of God. It made sense to think of him as the fulfillment of all those prophecies from the Hebrew Scriptures. So I think the Gospels tell us more about the experience of those communities, perhaps, than they do directly about the person of Jesus. And scholars work hard to uncover who the historical Jesus was and to tease out from the texts what we can know about the historical Jesus. But I think the writers of the Gospels were less concerned about that and more concerned about who this person was for us now in the light of the resurrection.
In terms of the New Testament itself, yes, Jesus is, if you like, the central theme of the New Testament, but the answers that the New Testament offers, or the way that the New Testament talks about Jesus, is actually offering different understandings of Jesus. The most, if you like, the top drawer kind of view of Jesus is what you'll find in John chapter 1, the prologue to John's Gospel, where Jesus is the divine Logos, which has been there from the beginning, from before the beginning, and is up there with God and is God. Okay, that's the top level theological comment on Jesus in the New Testament, and of course it's corroborated or validated or echoed in some of the post-Pauline texts like Ephesians and Colossians, which also tend to talk in that sort of way. If you compare that, for example, with the letter to the Hebrews, well, Jesus is kind of devoted to a lesser place within the divine household. He's still the son and heir within the household, but he's not the master of the house. So in the letter to the Hebrews, Jesus has a different place in the universe than he does in the Gospel of John. And if you go to the letters of Paul, which are the earliest Christian text, where they're first trying to kind of make sense of this Jesus thing, then we find this strange formula that's used all the time. Paul typically begins his letters with some version of this: from Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, and to the saints of God, or whatever, grace and peace and so on. But he's going to say, from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, so for Paul, there's still two separate entities that he's working with here. And he can't talk of God the Father without talking of Jesus, and vice versa, but he hasn't yet got to the Johannine kind of principle. And when we go back to the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is a much more complicated story, focusing naturally on what Jesus said, what Jesus did, and really comparing him with the prophets of the Old Testament rather than with God. You know, someone greater than Moses, greater than Elijah, greater than John the Baptist even. So the benchmark in the Synoptic Gospels are other prophets. How does Jesus rate against the prophets? For Paul, Jesus has to be mentioned in the context of God the Father, but that reflects the Roman household system, where there'll be a father in charge of the household, and there'll be another person who's really the one you have to deal with. And that's the model that Paul is dealing with. By the time you get to Hebrews, there's still a bit of that, but it's become a bit more sophisticated. And by the time you get to John and Colossians and Ephesians, then Jesus is the embodiment of the fullness of God. So the New Testament speaks about Jesus in different ways, which keeps people teaching Christology in a job, I guess. So a large bit of the New Testament does not agree with the Nicene Creed and the Council of Chalcedon, but so when we say this is what the New Testament says about Jesus, do we identify the highest point, take that as the norm, and apply it backwards to all the other pieces, or do we recognize the New Testament doesn't speak about Jesus with one voice? I'm one of those scholars who tends to focus on the diversity of the scriptural witness rather than trying to shoehorn it all into a nicely shaped shoe that's come out of the Council of Chalcedon.
We'll get there still.